Welcome. My name is Patrick Curran, and along with my totally non-defensive friend Greg Hancock, we make up Quantitude. We are a podcast dedicated to all things quantitative, ranging from the relevant to the completely irrelevant. In this week's episode, Greg and I explore the fascinating world of suppressor variables, which have the nearly magical, yet fully understandable distinction of being unrelated to the dependent variable, yet serving to enhance the predictive utility of other variables in the model. Along the way, we also discuss getting the giggles, giving away our secrets, Sigmund Freud, repressed variance, Greg's defense mechanisms, Kaiser Soze, the Cookie Monster, squirrel-proof bird feeders, World War II, street magicians, Paul's corpse, and before zero was invented. We hope you enjoy this week's episode. On many prior occasions, we have talked about how even in the most professional settings, you and I somehow manage to get the giggles.
You mean like that?
I had one this fall where I was in a dissertation meeting. Mm-hmm. Loyal listeners know that we got a long walk before we pivot into the topic for the day. We're going to play this hand cards up, and we're just going to tell you this episode is on suppression. Okay. All right? So there you go.
You've given away all our podcast secrets.
Exactly. I was in a dissertation defense, and I was an outside member, and they did not find an effect that they had hypothesized. They didn't say that it was possibly because of low power. They didn't say that it was possibly because of poor measurement. Heaven forbid they didn't say that it was due to their theory being wrong.
What?
It was suppression. But they did not say suppression. They said repression. And everybody at the table doubled down on it and talked about repressor variables and about variance being repressed and how an effect was repressed. Now, going back 3 decades in my clinical training, I have a vague memory of psychoanalytic theory. Now, of course, that is not widely used in the field. It's still out there, but it's not widely used. Just as a reminder, suppression is volitional. It's a deliberate, conscious effort to push down unwanted thoughts. Repression is a very similar process, except it's unconscious. And so what you're doing is you're pushing down distressing thoughts and feelings, but you're not aware that you're doing that. So, for example, when some teenager appeared at our doorstep last week, we said, "Oh, right, I have kids. I forgot." We repressed that we had children. But my point is the topic is suppression, and the entire discussion became psychoanalytic in this dissertation meeting about how variance was being repressed in a variable, and I managed to give myself the giggles because all I could picture were Freud's defense mechanisms at the level of psychometric theory.
Okay, so I have not even been exposed to these, right, since I have no training in psychology or any of those things. But you said defense mechanisms, so there's more.
Okay, there is more. You have been exposed to these because I've observed 6 or 8 or 10 of these in you over a many-year period.
What?
Okay, so as a public service, we're going to do a quick review of defense mechanisms. Now, I'll tell you what, let's not use you as an example because this could get massively uncomfortable.
I am already uncomfortable.
What I want to do is I'm going to give you a couple of these and you tell me how they operate for academia, all right?
Okay.
Let's start with repression. So repression is you unconsciously push away painful, unwanted thoughts.
Yeah, I do have an example looking at you right now. A paper that I wrote, and we discussed this a while ago, I got a review that said, I'm not even sure this paper is necessary. I repressed that until on an earlier episode, you revealed that was your review
I wrote
of
that
my
review
paper.
10 years before we ever met.
Yes. So thank you. I have repressed that.
It's as if it never existed, right?
That's right. It's the only way I can deal with you.
One of the things Freud said is you only really encounter psychological problems when your defense mechanisms fail. When they're operating correctly, you're actually psychologically healthy, at least on the surface. I mean, you yourself are like a boiling cauldron of defense mechanism. But we're not talking about you. We're talking about academia. So denial.
Okay.
That you just simply refuse to accept reality because it's too distressing.
So, like a hypothetical faculty member whose teaching evaluations are getting worse over time, but just keeps telling themselves that, well, students are just aren't what they used to be. Would that count as denial?
Exactly. Okay, this one I love. Projection. All right. So you attribute your own unacceptable thoughts and feelings on someone else.
So would it be like things that I'm insecure about in myself that I criticize you for?
Exactly.
Okay.
You would never, ever do that.
No?
But exactly.
Okay. I think that's the basis of our relationship.
But it just goes on and on and on, right? There's something called displacement, and that's where, like, you yell at a coworker because you're mad at your boss.
Kicking the dog, right?
Exactly. So if you're a grad student and you get yelled at by your advisor, it's because they want to yell at their chair, but they can't. So they're just going to yell at you. One I like is the thing called reaction formation. Now, this one, okay, we'll end on this because there are a whole bunch of these that we could do, but this one I love. Reaction formation is you act in a way that's opposite to your true feelings or impulses. So a classic example is that you are overly, excessively kind to somebody who you hate.
You see that all the time in academia where people are just like, oh, yes, of course. But behind the scenes, at the bar, in the restroom, you know that that's exactly the opposite of the way they feel.
When I started at University of North Carolina, I was at one of my very first faculty meetings. There were two senior people going back and forth about a particular topic. One would say, oh, that is a really nice insight. But what I'd add to that is, and then they said something, and then the other person said, oh, that's a lovely addition. But then what that changes is, and it's going back and forth, and a guy sitting next to me leaned over, and he knew I was brand new. He leaned over and he said, just to let you know, this is a vitriolic argument that's going on right now. And I was like, okay, lesson learned. So anyway, that's our little public service of psychoanalytic theory applied to academia. What we're going to talk about today is not repression.
Yeah. What is it we're talking about then?
You repressed the first 10 minutes of recording is what you did. But we are going to talk about suppression.
All right.
So coming full circle to the dissertation meeting and maybe slightly better understanding why I got the giggles other than I'm just juvenile and immature.
Well, yeah.
They were talking about variance being repressed, and what they meant to say was it was suppressed or potentially could be suppressed by some other variable that they didn't have in their data file. Now, we had an episode a while ago where we likened multicollinearity to Kaiser Soze. That's a character out of a famous movie. What it is if there's ever something that you can't understand or is an outcome that you didn't predict, it's because of Kaiser Soze.
Keaton always said, I don't believe in God, but I'm afraid of him. Well, I believe in God, and the only thing that scares me is Kaiser Soze.
And suppression is a little bit like that. People say, well, the reason I didn't find an effect is there's a suppressor variable that I did not have in my data file. So let's start out with a simple definition, and then we're going to drill into it. There have been many, many papers written about this. We'll talk about some of these to varying degrees, and we'll also go back historically a little bit. This was first identified by a guy named Paul Horst in 1941. But there's another guy named Anthony Conger who expanded on some of Horst's stuff and wrote a very important paper in 1974. And he has one of the cleanest definitions, I think, of what a suppressor is, that then we as a field went and just completely muddied the water by adding like 11 different variations to it. And we'll note those as well. Conger writes, a suppressor variable is defined to be a variable which increases the predictive validity of another variable or set set of variables by its inclusion in a regression equation. This variable is a suppressor only for those variables whose regression weights are increased. So this is kind of crazy town when you think about it from a regression standpoint, right?
So that means that I run a regression. We don't have to have multiple predictors to start. Just for simplicity, we could imagine that we have a single predictor, right? We've got an X and we've got a Y. And I do some kind of regression there, and I find that X maybe doesn't have a great slope predicting Y. And so what you're saying by Conger's definition is that if I bring in this third variable, then all of a sudden magically X is able to have more predictive value in helping us understand Y.
That's exactly right. If you're out there and you know this very well as we are skimming along the surface of this, there are many, many technical complexities. There are many subtypes of suppression. But here's the simplest. As Greg says, you have X predicting Y, and we have some beta associated with that. And in that single predictor, the squared semi-partial is the same as the multiple R squared, is the same as the standardized beta, representing that effect. There's some prediction. Now, a suppressor, let's call it Z, just to keep track of things.
Sure.
In a classic sense, this is the weird part. Z is not related to Y. And this is the Kaiser-Soze part.
That is.
Z does not predict Y, but Z is related to X. All right, so Z co-varies with X. So picture X predicting Y, and let's just make up numbers and say that explains 10% of the variance in Y. We bring in Z as a second predictor. Z has no unique prediction of Y, but X now accounts for 20% of the variance.
Who's your boss? I work for Kaiser Soze.
And this is where we usually throw up our hands and say, I quit.
One of the first things out of the gate here that bothers me about this, I mean, yes, there's but it's not even related to Y thing. That should bother me a little bit. But even the term suppression is bothering me in this, because the way that we are describing it, it sounds like we're doing anything but suppressing. It sounds like we're enhancing things. So the terminology right out of the gate is bugging me.
And it should. Some people have argued later, suppression was a horrible name. It's a misnomer because it isn't referring to suppressing an effect. And I got to tell you, I have seen as many times the use of the term refer to that, where, oh, well, there would be an effect, but it's being suppressed.
Oh, no.
It actually works the opposite. It doesn't suppress a prediction. You know what he meant the term to be is Z suppresses irrelevant variance in the predictor X. When you suppress irrelevant variance in the predictor, then that magnifies the relation between that predictor and the outcome because you've taken a bite out of that variability and removed the irrelevant stuff and left the relevant stuff.
I think about my predictor as having at least two parts to it inside. It's like this aggregate of good stuff and bad stuff. And I mean good stuff from a predictive standpoint. But because it's this composite of those kinds of things, it's having a hard time letting the good stuff predict Y. And so in comes Z. Z is suppressing the bad stuff so that the good stuff in X can do the prediction of Y, right? So in one sense, it's suppressing this irrelevant stuff. And in the other sense, it is enhancing the predictive ability of the good stuff that's in X.
And to highlight this from a higher level mathematical statistical standpoint, I'm going to bring in the Cookie Monster. All right, this is how I teach this often.
Hello, and welcome to Professor Cookie Monster's Subtraction School. Nom, 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 nom.
Keep in mind, I'm at a state university, so there's that. Yeah. Think about Venn diagrams, where overlapping parts of the circle represent shared variance and non-overlapping parts of the circle represent unique variance or unshared. Now, picture what I described where X predicted Y and accounted for 10% of the variability. Well, picture a Venn diagram with just two circles. X has some slight overlap, 10% overlap with Y. Now we're going to bring in Z, and let's go to the extreme where Z really is unrelated to Y. Well, Z is going to overlap with X and take a bite out of that to the degree that it overlaps. And what it's biting out is it's just like the Cookie Monster where he bites out of the cookie.
Nom, 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 nom.
is he's biting away that irrelevant variance, and then what's left is a circle with a bite out of it that's X, and that's enhancing that relation. When you talk about what proportion overlaps with Y, that proportion increases.
Yeah, because you got rid of the proportion that wasn't overlapping with Y.
See, it's all Cookie Monster.
It is all Cookie Monster.
Whack-a-mole, Reaper, Agatha Christie's corpse. Come on, man. None of this stuff is that hard.
I remember learning about this the very first time with an example from Horst. Still sticks with me because I think it's an incredibly good example of this.
Now, before you give your example, I have a very brief story about a guy I met once named Paul, who he and I spent half a lunch talking about squirrel-proofing bird feeders. Go back in time 25 years. I'm a young assistant professor. I'm at a conference. There's an outdoor luncheon. There's one seat left at a 10 top, and I sit down next to an elderly gentleman. We proceed to have an absolutely lovely talk. We talk for an hour straight, and we talked about bird feeders and wild birds and squirrel-proofing bird feeders. It was just a charming lunch. And I walked away, and another guy came up who was more senior to me and said, well, you're going to remember that conversation for your life. And I said, well, it was about bird feeders and squirrels. I do lead a shallow life. I'm not sure I'm going to remember that one for life. And he said, do you know who that was? And I said, yeah, Paul. He said, that was Paul Horst.
Wow.
And I was like, oh my God. For those of you in the game, Paul Horst is a titan. He was a student of Thurstone's. He was a co-founder of the Psychometric Society. He was one of the first co-editors of Psychometrica. He is an absolute titan. And sitting next to him, I never got past Paul, and we just talked about bird feeders.
Well, he did some other stuff too, it turns out. The example had to do with, it was during World War II or around that time, and the interest was in predicting pilot ability. There were multiple predictors, but they were all reasoning type tasks, mechanical reasoning and spatial reasoning and numerical reasoning. You would like to think that mechanical reasoning, numerical reasoning, spatial reasoning would have some reasonable predictive value in trying to understand pilot ability, but actually they weren't terrific predictors. Now I have this other variable, verbal ability. Verbal ability is in no way related to the piloting ability, but when this gets entered into the regression equation, all of a sudden, mechanical reasoning, numerical reasoning, spatial reasoning are doing a better job of predicting the pilot ability than if verbal ability had not been put in there at all. Why is that? What the heck is going on? Well, these were paper and pencil tests, the mechanical reasoning, the numerical reasoning, spatial reasoning. They required pretty decent verbal ability to be able to interpret the questions and answer them. But as far as piloting ability goes, that verbal ability was irrelevant. But the inclusion of verbal ability in there as a variable was able to essentially suppress that irrelevant part of the score that people got on numerical and mechanical and spatial ability, so that the real relevant parts of those things could shine in terms of predicting pilot's ability. So verbal ability was suppressing the bad stuff so that that good stuff could come through and be enabled in its predictive value.
I love that. And just to clarify, it's bad stuff only with respect to it wasn't predictive of pilot ability.
That's right.
It was irrelevant variability with respect to the system of equations that we were studying. Because what's really interesting is a suppressor is only identified as a suppressor in relation to how it impacts the effects of other variables. There is no such thing as a variable that in and of itself is inherently a suppressor. You may have a variable that doesn't correlate with the dependent variable because it doesn't correlate with the dependent variable and nothing more. So it's very interesting because verbal ability could be a very strong repressor. I said repressor.
Boom.
Okay, I'm a little more sympathetic to the student. That's all going to get edited out, by the way, because it makes me look stupid.
And it was not edited out. Patrick makes an actual Freudian slip and wants to cut it? I don't think so. In fact, wouldn't that be denial?
verbal ability could be a strong suppressor in that example with Horst, but the very same sample and the very same measure, but with 3 different predictors, it may not serve as a suppressor at all.
That's right. It's very context dependent. I think of each of those predictors as being a composite. And you're right. I very sloppily said it's made up of good stuff and bad stuff. But I need that mental model of thinking about that predictor as having 2 parts for the word suppression to make sense and for the concept of enabling or enhancing to make sense as well. It's a great example, and it lives, right? It's the one that people go back to when they keep rewriting papers on suppression.
Like anything, and we don't mean this pejoratively, it's just kind of more lighthearted, but there's no concept in quantitative methods that we can't take and make it more complicated still. There have been some really good papers written on this. There are terms of classic versus absolute versus negative versus mutual versus reciprocal. Some have cast in terms of ratios of correlations. Some have recast it as there's C-type suppression and V-type suppression. They're all real. It's a pattern of correlations about how does this come out when you compare across models. But really, the core of it remains unchanged. Is our ability to predict the outcome enhanced with the inclusion of one or more variables that they themselves are not meaningfully predictive of the outcome? And that's the weirdo thing about it. When you've got the street magician, where is the styrofoam ball, pen and teller kind of thing, it's not a mystery. It's not an artifact. It's not magical. And you can't invoke it just to explain why you didn't find an effect.
And like that, he's gone. He becomes a myth, a spook story that criminals tell their kids at night. Rat on your pop, and Kaiser Soze will get you.
So you mentioned all these papers that have been written. I'm going to say something that's probably not very nice. I don't know how much we need in practice about all the nuance of suppression, because there is a whole, not just a literature on it, there's all of these specialized terms for all of the different kinds of suppression that we could experience. In my view, a lot of that is just because of interesting patterns of positive relations becoming negative and all of that. And honestly, I don't care from a practical standpoint. What I care about in suppression, and what I love about suppression, is that it maps onto a model or belief system that they have about these particular variables. So when you dig into some of the literature, it will just have you computing correlations and regression coefficients and go, suppression, thank you very much. I could not care less about it until you start putting variables with meaning. I understand mechanical reasoning and verbal ability, and I understand why suppression would be operating. I don't think about it in terms of all of the patterns of things that might occur. An example that I like is that sometimes standardized tests are not particularly predictive of an outcome when we say, but it should be. Well, sometimes that's because those standardized tests are administered under conditions where there's very, very high stakes and there's a lot of test anxiety. Okay, well, what that would mean conceptually, theoretically, from a model standpoint, is that someone's performance on a test can be thought of as having a couple of components inside it. One that is their ability on the subject matter of interest, and the other is a part that's associated with their test anxiety. I would like the test to be predictive of something, and maybe it's the anxiety that's getting in the way of its ability to be predictive. Enter a measure of test anxiety. That can help to suppress the part of the test score performance that is associated with anxiety, so that, as I called, the good stuff, the predictive stuff in the test can actually make the prediction that we need to predict. That's how I think about suppression. That to me is the utility in it. Honestly, whether test anxiety correlates with the outcome or not, it's very dramatic if it doesn't and we put it in anyway. It might have a little relation. It might not have a little relation. It might be positively related to things. It might be negatively related to things. I don't really care. What I care about is the model and why things are doing what they are doing and that they make sense. And that to me is one of the values of thinking about suppression.
In that spirit, I'm going to tap into one of the more recent papers that is only 24 years old. It's Dave McKinnon, Jennifer Kroll, and Chandra Lockwood, and it's a lovely little paper. I'm holding it right here, Prevention Science in 2000. And the title of the paper is The Equivalence of the Mediation, Confounding, and Suppression Effect. So I'm going to ask everybody to think briefly in path diagram terms. I want you to picture just X predicting Y. So a little square of X and a single-headed arrow and a little square of Y, and it's X predicting Y. Now, there are two variables. We want to bring in a third variable. Well, there are three ways that Dave talks about it. It can come in as a mediator, it can come in as a confounder, or it can come in as a suppressor. Let's picture a mediator. So X predicting Y. If we bring in Z and it's acting as a mediator, it is in part explaining why X predicts Y. So imagine that X is parent drinking, Y is adolescent drinking, and you say, well, why is parent drinking positively related to adolescent drinking? Maybe the mediator is impaired parenting. So if a parent drinks, their parenting of the child is impaired, and because of that impaired parenting, the child is more likely to drink themselves. All right, that's option one. All right, option two is a confounder, and we all love these. The positive correlation between the number of fire trucks sent to a fire and the damage done by the fire. But one that I like is there is a positive prediction from income to incidence of cancer. So on average, if you make more money, you are more likely to have cancer. Well, the Z variable comes in, and it points to both X and Y, and that's age. Older people tend to make more money. Older people tend to have more cancer. And so when you omit that, that effect is then driven into the XY relation. All right. So same three variables, just a different conceptual model. Then the third is what we've been talking about, is you have X predicting Y and we bring in Z just as a second predictor. It correlates with X, predicts Y. And what it does is it enhances that relation between X and Y. So the mediation accounts for it, the confounder reduces it, and the suppressor enhances that. And then the big part of what Dave showed is they are all numerically identical in how you empirically evaluate it. They are the same. And so what that means is it's not a statistical issue, it's a conceptual one.
If someone looked at the prescription from 1941 for diagnosing whether or not you've got a suppression scenario, what's the relation without this other variable, what's the relation with this variable, etc., it would diagnose all three of those things exactly the same way.
That's exactly right. And numerically to like the 32nd decimal point. He shows with very simple derivations that they're exactly the same test. And we've talked a lot in the past about equivalent models and re-expressing covariances as regressions and so on. It's not a leap, especially in a simple three-variable system. Picture a model where we have two correlated predictors, X and Z of Y, and we get the regression coefficients in the R-squared. And then we just redraw it where Z predicts X and X predicts Y, but Z also predicts Y. Those are numerically equivalent.
Yes.
Because all we've done is recast a covariance as a regression coefficient. So he says at the very end of the paper, these last few lines, for any given set of data, there may be a number of different possible models that fit the data equally well. The fact that mediation, confounding, and suppression models are statistically equivalent underlies this point. The statistical procedures provide no indication of which type of effect is being tested. That information must come from other sources.
Other sources are theory and our understanding of the world and the variables that we have sitting there on the table. And that for me is one of the frustrations that I have with the suppression literature. You know, there's all this stuff that goes on back in the 40s or 70s or whatever. But then Dave comes in 2000 or whenever it is and says, you can't do any of this really without a model. You know, I want to go, duh, of course you can't. All of this only makes sense, I think, in the context of the meaning and nature of the variables and your understanding of those.
And I think that's one of the few points we want to make in this episode. It is entirely dictated by your theoretical model, by your conceptual model. How you select your measures, how you incorporate them in the parameterization of the model has a huge impact on whether it's a mediator, a confounder, or a suppressor. It's all based on theory. So suppression is not a weirdo thing. It's not a magic trick. It's not the regression fairy giving you negative variances or correlations over one. This is just a natural outcome of our theoretical model and our concepts of how some things relate to other things, and then how we manifest those concepts into a statistical model with directed effects or non-directed effects. What I do not think it should be used for is explaining why you didn't find an effect. I see this fairly commonly, is a treatment was not effective, or some person-level predictor was not predictive of the outcome when it was theorized. Nobody talks about low power or poor measurement or a non-random sample, or that your theory is wrong. It's that, well, we must have omitted an important suppressor variable that if we had it, that would have shown that there was a significant predictor. Woe be the person who says, well, that's certainly a possibility. What would theory say that suppressor would be?
You got to think about this on the front end. You have to think about what might there be in my predictor that is inhibiting it from being able to manifest its full predictive value in terms of understanding why, and go out and get those variables. We do this kind of stuff all the time with other control variables. We do this with auxiliary variables when we're thinking about missing data. We talked about doing this with instrumental variables. Well, absolutely, we should be doing this with suppressor variables too. Thinking about what aspects of our key predictors are going to be inhibited and what variables can we go get to help suppress that part so that it can flourish as a predictor.
We've well established that all of my most strongly held opinions really are not supported by any objective empirical evidence, and so I'm going to continue to do that here. I have two hypotheses about why this still kind of floats around and people are uncomfortable in talking about this, and how every paper, no matter what decade it's written in, starts with suppression remains an underappreciated and misunderstood concept, and Paul's corpse is saying, I unambiguously defined that 80 years ago.
Squirrels!
Yeah, damn squirrels. But one, I do believe that this is omitted from a lot of curriculum and teaching. Maybe it's a little footnote, maybe it's a hand wave, maybe you don't get to it at all. But I think that it would be nice to take 20 minutes, because that's all it would take, with a couple of Venn diagrams, and talk about where's the Cookie Monster taking the bite out of it. Is what happens if Z takes a bite out of X but not Y? Well, that is a suppressor right there. What if Z takes a bite out of both X and Y at the same time? Well, then that's a correlated predictor in the usual way that we would have that. So really, you can teach the whole thing with just Cookie Monster in 15 minutes. So part of it is I don't think it's well represented in our curriculum. But another part is a good thing, I believe, which is when you and I came up through the system back when dinosaurs still roamed the earth, we were taught, and I was at least, I can't speak for you, because they hadn't invented zero yet for you, but we often would look at a bivariate correlation table to select which predictors to include in our model. And there is a special place in hell for us who did that back in the day, because there are 83 ways from Friday that goes wrong. We have nonlinear relations, we have interactive relations, we have unique relations, compound relations, all of these things. That's a horrible, horrible thing to do. But what people would say is, hey, be careful with that, because if you have a variable that doesn't correlate with Y, it might actually enhance the relation of the other variables. Don't throw away a variable because it might be a suppressor. Well, rarely, if ever, do we do that anymore in the field, thank goodness, because that's a horrible way of doing business. And so we actually often, in my opinion, don't know if suppression even exists. So if we went back to Paul's example in 1941, one. How we might do it now is to say, well, a priori, my theory says that mechanical, numerical, spatial, and verbal ability are all related to pilot ability. And you and I know there's this wonky thing that when verbal ability is out and then bring it in, there's a difference in the prediction. If we a priori define that 4-predictor model, we don't compare it with verbal in and out, and we don't even know that the suppression is going on.
So unsurprisingly, you and I wind up back where we always wind up, and that is having a model, having a belief system about how these things work, having a path model that articulates the relations among these variables that you would expect. And as you said, for God's sake, don't throw things out because they have zero relation with your outcome or criterion variable. Those could be really important variables, and you should have known that when you were going out to gather the data in the first place. Suppressor variables are incredibly useful, but you really have to think through the whole family of relations that are operating with your path diagram. And anybody who thinks otherwise is repressing that? Did I use that right?
Sure, we'll go with that.
Okay. Okay. This is my first attempt at defense mechanisms.
Yeah, folks. First attempt. Did I point out that one of them on the list is defensiveness?
I'm not defensive.
Oh, boy. We don't have the time. Thanks, everybody.
Take care, everybody. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thanks so much for joining us. Don't forget to tell your friends to subscribe to us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever they go for something to help them suppress all the other craziness going on in their lives. You can follow us on X or Blue Sky and visit our website, quantitudepod.org, where you can leave us a message, find organized playlists and show notes and syllabi, search for past episodes, and other fun stuff. And finally, get cool Quantitude merch, like shirts, mugs, stickers, and spiral notebooks from redbubble.com, where all proceeds from non-bootleg authorized Quantitude Pod merch continue to go to donorschoose.org to help support low-income schools. You've been listening to Quantitude, the podcast that no amount of psychoanalysis could explain why you are still listening to after all these years. But we're so glad you are. Today's episode has been sponsored by that hilarious game of Freudian defense mechanisms, Sigmund Says, where we give you a statement made in an academic context, and you have to figure out what the defense mechanism is. Let's play. If someone said, I know the fit indices are terrible, but it can't be the model. There must be a problem with the data. Sigmund says,
This is denial, refusing to acknowledge reality or facts to avoid emotional distress.
Or how about, sure, our small samples results are inconsistent with the other studies, but that just shows how complex and nuanced the phenomenon is. Sigmund says,
Rationalization, justifying unacceptable behaviors or outcomes with logical but false explanations.
What about this one? I can't believe my manuscript just got rejected. All right, class. For next week, I want you to read these 12 articles and write a 25-page proposal for a unique line of research inspired by these articles. Sigmund says,
Displacement, redirecting emotions or impulses from their original source to a substitute target.
Or, of course, Professor, the entire lab team would love to do the data cleaning for the new wave of data. It's our favorite part of the research process. Sigmund says,
Reaction formation, expressing the opposite of one's true feelings to hide or counteract them.
And finally, sure, the effect size is tiny, but look how beautiful and colorful my figures are. Sigmund says,
Compensation, overemphasizing strengths in one area to make up for perceived weaknesses in another. Not unlike when you haven't published anything for a while, but keep saying, hey, look at my podcast. This is most definitely not NPR.